Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this lovely Sunday evening. Um, I'm assuming a lot of you are very dedicated practitioners, so I'm not surprised that you're sacrificing your weekend hours to be joining something like this. But I'm always feeling very privileged when something like that happens because um, I don't at all feel confident or qualified to be talking about something like this, a very profound, very ancient text that actually has a lot of mileage to it in terms of many generations of practitioners have been working with these techniques. These are very, very esteemed, very, very highly respected words in a way, and they're transmitted with a lot of reference. So for a village person like me to come and talk to people in London about something like this text is quite strange, but sometimes that's just our karma, right? And like, um, I've been forced to do it, let's say, by my karmic circumstances and by Pat's very generous invitation. So I'll just offer what I can. I'll do my best. And just as a brief introduction, and then we can do some meditation, actually. Oh, more people are joining. Sorry. My name is Michael Lobsang Tenpa. Most people just call me Tenpa or Lobsang. Very few people call me Michael. And the strange second half of my name comes from the fact that I was a Buddhist monastic for 9.5 years. And I've been a Buddhist translator and interpreter for 12, 13 years, and a Buddhist practitioner for more than half of my life. And the only reason why I am sometimes invited to talk about things like this text or other similar teachings is that I've spent some time with the greatest lamas of our generation and of the previous generations. Some of them have passed away since then, and I've had the incredible privilege of accompanying some of them as an interpreter or translator or working with their books or just receiving teachings from them. And some of them have been really encouraging with regards to my work as a translator or as a provider of different secular modalities related to mind training. So teaching secular ethics or practices of loving kindness and compassion. Lamas have been very, very supportive of that, and even supportive of me first being a monk, then not being a monk, kind of awkward, you would think, but they have been really, really incredibly kind and patient with me, probably because they do apply teachings like this all the time. And that is really inspiring in a way where you see the openness, the flexibility, and the never ceasing love and compassion that genuine practitioners have. It kind of inspires your mind to also play with that, to explore that, to see if a similar transformation can occur within your own mind. At least that's my experience. So the text that we're going to look at today is a teaching on transforming our habitual mental states. Just as a preliminary research, let me ask if anyone here has studied the 8 verses of mind training before. Okay, at least one person, but that gives me a clear idea. And then if anyone has heard about the so-called Lojong teachings before and has received an explanation of what that means. No? Okay, a couple of people. So I'll pretend that we're all beginners. I know I am a beginner for sure. So first, this very general context for these teachings. This specific text belongs to a literary genre in Tibetan culture that is called Lojong. And the word Lojong itself consists of two roots, or two parts. Lo, which means mind, or sometimes intellect, or sometimes attitude, or thinking, thought, mentality. There's many different ways of translating that. And then Jong, which can mean to exercise, but also to refine, to purify. Once again, these roots are very rich, so there's a wide variety of interpretations there. But the most common interpretation or translation for the word Lojong in general is mind training. And that's why we frequently see it on the covers of different books. There's quite a few books by the Dalai Lama and other highly esteemed lamas of our time with mind training in the name. And you actually have a beautiful, huge volume translated by Geshe Langri, who did first his monastic training in India as a Tibetan in exile, living in exile, then did his studies in Oxford, became a very prominent translator, one of the primary translators of the Dalai Lama and works with a lot of scriptural material. He is publishing a wonderful series of books called Library of Tibetan Classics, and one of the volumes in that cycle is called Mind Training, and it contains many, 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 many texts like this, because it's a whole genre once again. And each text represents genuinely a full set of instructions for completely transforming our mind. So there's different ways of reading these texts. One way to read a text such as this one, and that's the more common explanation for this, is as a wonderful set of suggestions on how to transform the quality of our daily life. So just something on top of our daily existence that would gradually help us become more wholesome in our behavior, in our thinking, in our way of dealing with others primarily, but also in our self-perception and in our ways of dealing with a society in general, with issues of social justice and so forth. It's all going to get transformed through us applying something like this. Another way of looking at the same genre, and even this specific text, is by seeing it as a complete set of instructions for attaining full awakening. So not simply set of wonderful ideas on how to become a better human being, which this definitely is. This is a text of that genre. This is what it's going to present to us. But at the same time, if we know how to read these texts in a more profound way, they would offer us a complete path to awakening that we can practice with for many years, and then genuinely, eventually, if we are practicing correctly, diligently, and so forth, we will be getting first realizations, so breakthrough moments that transform our mind in an irreversible manner. And then eventually, through accumulating those realizations one after another, we can arrive at the state of full awakening. That's not inconceivable when working with a text like this. So ideally, we would have both in mind when reading something like this. So it's something that can be applied right now, and something that, if we work with this over many years in a cave, would take us to full awakening. So in a way, this is a wonderful thing, because you can wrap this up, put it in your pocket, and then go about your life, and at some point be like, oh, why not go in a cave right now? I already have this one sheet of paper, and it contains everything I need. And indeed, you might then go into a full-on cave retreat, practice there for 40 years, and emerge a radiant, fully awakened being. That's not completely inconceivable. So there's that flexibility there. And we're constantly sort of moving between these two ways of reading the Lojong texts. Sometimes because we need advice on how to deal with circumstances, obstacles, and problems right now. So we're freaking out. Our mind is exploding because something horrible is happening in our life. Divorce, being fired, another war, pandemic. Okay, I need something that will keep me sane. So we turn to a text like this and we find sanity therein. And we're also hopefully think of great practitioners who have been applying texts such as this. And one incredible thing about living in this day and age is that we are quite literally still catching a generation of Tibetans who have lived through the genocide, the occupation, and so forth. Some of them have stayed have been kept in concentration camps for many years. Some of them suffered torture and unimaginable things, horrible things. And to maintain their sanity, to uphold their sanity and kindness and compassion, they were practicing with teachings like this one. And then they emerge not deeply traumatized, broken, irreparably damaged, suicidal, sad beings, but beings that are even more radiant, loving, compassionate, open, wise, flexible, full of laughter, full of humor, and so forth. And that really inspires us, because it shows us that these teachings can not only protect our mind from being deeply traumatized by something horrible happening. These teachings, when applied in these extreme circumstances, can actually transform us into something more awakened than before. So that's the original inspiration, and I have had the incredible fortune of meeting quite a few of those beings. Two examples always come to mind, two great masters whose lives have been quite parallel to each other. Maybe you have heard of them before. If not, I definitely recommend checking them out. One of them was a great yogi called Yangtang Rinpoche, a great practitioner of the Nyingma tradition within Tibetan Buddhism, who was put in a concentration camp, practiced in a concentration camp in the occupied Tibet, and then eventually emerged from Tibet when there was a little bit of a uh, there was a period where Tibetans were treated a little bit less harshly, very temporarily. It's back to the horrible things happening again. So he was released. He was able to escape to India. Eventually, he was able to travel a little bit. He taught in the United States, in a few other places, and he primarily stayed in Sikkim, which is where I met him and had the incredible fortune of receiving teachings from him. And he was, for example, one of the yogis that never sleep, never had to actually sleep. He only did about 1 hour of quiet meditation during the night and then resumed his activity. And there was quite a few yogis like this in this generation of old masters. And overall, just his presence was full of bliss, compassion, wisdom, incredibly peaceful when you were in his presence, incredible clarity of mind. Even though his vision was failing, he could barely walk by the time I met him, and then he passed away 2 years after that. Very, very clear in his meditation, clear in his teachings, very patient, very curious about the world, actually, asking questions about other parts of the world and what's happening there. And wow, how fascinating, that kind of thing. And just radiating peace, but also incredibly humble, even though he eventually became the guru for all of the younger generation lamas, great lamas that are now coming up as the new leaders of Tibetan Buddhism. He was their lama in terms of passing on some of the important tantric transmissions, them initiations, teachings, and so forth. Still incredibly humble. And another lama who had a very similar life story is, and who is still alive, and it is incredibly important, I think, if possible, to make a connection with him through his online teachings, or at least through the wonderful documentary about him. Is called his name is Garchen Rinpoche, and there's a wonderful documentary about him on Vimeo, available for free, called "For the Benefit of All Beings." So his life story is quite similar. He was a highly respected reincarnate lama in Tibet. So he had some monasteries that he was overseeing. And eventually, when the occupation started happening, he felt the incredible urge to protect his homeland, but not simply his homeland. It wasn't simply about being nationalistic and saying, no, I'm going to take a gun and protect Tibet for the sake of Tibet. The whole motivation there, we need to protect, the motivation there was, we need to protect the Dharma for the benefit of all beings, because the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is actively trying to destroy the Dharma, to kill all the holders of the Dharma, and to kill such masters as His Holiness the Dalai Lama and so forth. So he joined the guerrilla fighters for a little while, and the one then was eventually captured, put to prison, spent many years in concentration camp being tortured in all sorts of ways, and eventually, just like Yangtang Rinpoche, released, came out of Tibet, went to India, met His Holiness the Dalai Lama after many, many, many years, and then slowly started teaching in the West and established an institute in Arizona, which is where he now resides. He used to travel all over the world before the pandemic, visiting Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Singapore, many other countries, and then eventually now he's just teaching from Arizona, and all of his teachings, all of his empowerments, transmissions, and so forth are available as webcasts, and there's many, many recordings, and he's truly seen as an embodiment of love. And his practice, while being in concentration camp, was also based on Lojong teachings. Not on this specific text, even though that's part of the overall collection of things. He uses a slightly more elaborate one called 37 Practices of the Bodhisattva, but they are all the same in that they all contain the same key points. So you can look at the whole genre through the 8 verses of mind training, or 7 points of mind training, that's another set, or 37 practices. And as many of you would know, Buddhists love numbered lists. That's why all of these strange names. But whichever numbered list you're using, they all boil down to the same key points of wisdom and compassion, and to the same different ways of working with us. So that's kind of the overall idea. So well, when working with a text like that, it's important to, yes, revisit it again and again, reread the text itself again and again, reread commentaries or listen to commentaries again and again. There are many wonderful commentaries available to this online as books, recordings of teachings by the Dalai Lama and many other masters. So there's all that. But at the same time, it's also important to regularly remind ourselves about the sources of inspiration, sort of the lineage that brought these teachings to us, and not simply a lineage that we can imagine as a line of old Asian men sitting on top of each other's heads. That's how the lineage is often depicted in tankas. This old man and this old man, and there's very few women you usually see in these depictions. And then after a while, after these, with this Asian man, you see a few old white dudes, and then it's you, and kind of like that. So in a way, it's true. Although there have been historically many great yoginis who practice the same teachings, it's just their stories have not been recorded for obvious reasons of patriarchy and so forth. So we can mentally add all the great yoginis of the past who have been practicing the same stuff. And then eventually we learn to see all those beings not simply as older people who are holders of this textual knowledge that, sure, it's like any other religion, whatever, but as people who have lived through horrible times, most of them, very difficult, very challenging circumstances all over the place, and plus personal tragedies. This master lost his wife, this master lost his child, this master lost his parents, this lived through an epidemic, this one saw a couple of wars, yada, yada, yada. They are people who, just like us, lived through many historical tragedies and personal tragedies and turned those into a wonderful source of compassion and wisdom. And when we think of those masters and maybe even supplicate them, which is one of the ways of working with this entire material, to connect to the lineage of inspiration by calling out to it from the depths of our heart. That's an important part of these teachings as well. When we do that, the idea is that we're calling out to their wisdom and compassion to awaken our own wisdom and compassion in a similar way, so that this fusion of wisdom and compassion can then radiate from us towards others. And once we have found that inspiration, a little bit of that, we look at the specific techniques that are described in these verses or in similar texts. So this kind of a theme that usually precedes the transmission, the formal transmission of such teachings. If you were to go to a Tibetan monastery and receive these instructions together with Tibetan monastics, monks, nuns, you would see that in the beginning of a transmission session, they would recite a lot of prayers, and it sounds very arcane to us as people who are not necessarily fluent in classical Tibetan, because there's just a lot of chanting. Sometimes it's very guttural, sometimes it's more melodic, but overall it's just, it's like something like this for sometimes 2 hours. And then finally the teachings begin. And when these preliminary prayers are recited, we're sometimes just checking out mentally, or we're enjoying it as we would enjoy a sound bath, because, just feel a good vibe. But there's not much understanding initially there. And that certainly has been the experience of the first generation of Westerners who tried attending those teachings in the 70s and the 80s, when Tibetan Buddhism started becoming more available to the global West. And then what emerged was an understanding that actually all of these chants that are recited in the beginning have a very specific psychological purpose. These are all psychological techniques that prepare our mind for receiving teachings such as this one, make our mind more fertile as soil for the act of receiving these teachings. And also in itself, this act in itself transforms our mind to a certain degree. It does in itself make our mind more flexible, more open, more compassionate, more wise, more mindful, and so forth, more patient. So that in itself is something that we can connect to. So quite a few of those prayers would be prayers in which we call out to our Dharma ancestors, all these lineage lamas, masters, yogis, yoginis, and so forth, who have come before us, all the way up to the historical Buddha, whose birth, enlightenment, and passing away we're celebrating today. And then beyond that, to all the great transhistoric Buddhas of the past, male, female, beyond male and female, and so forth, throughout numerous eons that have come in the past, taught the Dharma eventually disappeared, and now we're living in the time of Buddha Shakyamuni, as he's sometimes referred to in the Tibetan tradition. So coming from him, all the great masters were supplicating them, so that just that act of supplication would help us open our mind. And with a greater openness of our mind, and with those inspiring examples at the same time, we can then look at just 8 verses, or sometimes 4 lines even, sometimes 3 lines, sometimes 1 line, and sometimes 1 syllable. There are quintessential instructions of that nature as well. We would look at some of that, like, ooh, This is something I can apply right now. Let me do it. And then, bam, our life experience has suddenly changed. We're living in a new way, hopefully with a greater degree of happiness and contentment. So that's the overall goal. So let's do a preliminary meditation along the lines of that. If you wish, totally fine to not do that. You can just relax, or lie down and find some bliss. But the meditation is going to consist of establishing a profound sense of ease, and that's a practice that is important in the Tibetan tradition, sometimes referred to as settling our body, speech, and mind in their natural state. That comes from the lineage of the great yogi Padmasambhava. It's revered as one of the second Buddhas in the Tibetan lineage, so it's certainly a source of all the tantric teachings in Tibetan Buddhism, in a way. And then after that, the second half would be on inviting that inspiration into our heart before we start looking at the actual verses. So please find a comfortable stationary position, whatever works for you right now. It's fine to do all of these practices while lying down in Shavasana, honestly, but most of us usually, for these teaching occasions, prefer to use an upright position. So we take some moments to adjust our posture, checking the different parts of our body, and then arranging them nicely so that our body is both stable and relaxed at the same time. And having adjusted our position as necessary, we allow our awareness to descend into the depths of the body, and especially to the parts of the body that are currently in contact with the ground, with the earth beneath us. Noticing the sensations in those areas, which would include our feet and toes, the outer side of our legs, our buttocks, and so forth. And releasing the physical tension there if possible. Both the physical tension and the deliberate types of movement. Then coming up into our abdominal area and our lower back to explore the sensations and release the tension there as well. And then our chest and our shoulders. Down our upper arms, the area of the elbow, the forearms, And then our hands and fingers. Establishing a profound sense of stillness and relaxation right there. And from there, coming back to our shoulders, our neck, the back of the head, and our facial muscles. And then resting with the process of natural breathing, in which we're not holding the breath, not forcing it, but rather allowing its waves to slowly wash away all the types of tension, all agitation, all restlessness, while also strengthening the quality of clarity and vigilance within us. We are at ease, but clearly aware. In this case, of the sensations. With this fusion of relaxation, stability, and clarity, or relaxation, stillness, and vigilance, is what constitutes the natural state that we're trying to arrive at to prepare ourselves for study, contemplation, and practice. And then, with our body still resting, with our breath moving naturally, we undertake a short practice of inviting inspiration from our Dharma ancestors. Thinking of all the numerous masters that have in the past applied different forms of Lojong teachings. And of course, there are similar teachings for transforming our attitudes in non-Buddhist traditions. There's no shortage of attitude training or attitude transformation techniques in Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and so forth, and even in different secular philosophies as well. So we can think of everyone who has done this kind of mind bending in order to become more wise and more compassionate. And amongst those ancestors, if we wish, we can specifically focus on the lineage of transmission for this teaching, originating in the teachings of the historical Buddha, whose presence in this world is celebrated today by Tibetan Buddhist practitioners across the world. Then coming through many, many lineage masters, and then eventually arriving at the great living examples of people who have survived genocide and so forth by applying teachings such as this one and applying this specific teaching. And then with their infinite generosity, they have shared these with us by writing commentaries, providing the oral transmission, reminding us of the importance of these teachings and showing us our personal example. May the inspiring energy of all of that flow into our heart and mind and transform us from within. So we can just rest in that wish, or if we're more of a visual thinker, we can use the technique in which we breathe in the rainbow light of transformative inspiration. And then with each inhalation, as it enters our system, it fills up all of our energy channels, saturates our body, saturates our mind, and gradually removes all the obstacles for us becoming fully awakened for the benefit of all. So it's as if we're breathing in blessings and breathing out the union of kindness and wisdom. And our conventional identity that we're so used to and sometimes so focused on becomes merely a tool to serve others in the spirit of kindness and wisdom. So this aspiration to practice and share kindness and wisdom can become the motivation for the time that we're going to spend together. And having established that motivation, we can return to the body for a short while just to ground ourselves there. Once again, noticing the sensations. And then slowly, slowly, reintroducing some movements to the body by rocking back and forth, moving our fingers, our toes, activating our facial muscles, and slowly concluding the practice. Thank you. Don't be shy if you need to move a little bit, stretch, and so forth. This is an intro class, not a torture session. We're not there yet. We're not those great masters who have transformed their torture into practice. But there are daily problems, obviously, for all of us, starting with something as minor as a headache or relationship issues, or trying to deal with your parents or your children or your romantic partners. And within all of that, there's certain level of grace that's available to us. So even doing a practice like the one we did just now, of inviting this inspiring influence, that in itself is quite helpful for dealing with all of those issues, because the essence of all the Lojong teachings, all the Lojong texts, all the Lojong transmissions would always boil down to just these two words of wisdom and compassion, or wisdom and kindness. So you have wisdom, and then you have kindness, love, compassion. These are interchangeable in a way. And these are described as a so-called two wings of the bird that eventually reaches enlightenment. So in order to reach enlightenment, we'll always need these two components. And wherever we look in the Tibetan Buddhist practice, we would always see mentions of these two quintessential qualities that we need to consciously cultivate. And they're mentioned separately because we need to cultivate them by using slightly different techniques. Yes, every technique ideally would contribute to both wisdom and kindness, both wisdom and compassion. But some would be more on the wisdom side, and some would be more on the compassion side. And actually, it is not at all limited to simply the Tibetan Buddhist teachings. You see that in the Theravada teachings as well, quite strongly, but it's not as strongly emphasized. Whereas in Mahayana Buddhism in general, in the Sanskrit tradition of Buddhism, and specifically in the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist lineage, you have this written out, spelled out very, very clearly. We need to do some practices for wisdom, some for compassion, eventually integrate it all and become a fully awakened Buddha. So to do that, we use a text such as this one. And within this specific text, the first 7 verses are on the side of the compassion practice, compassion, love, kindness, all of that. The last verse, the 8th verse, is on the side of wisdom. So we'll go through the verses one by one, but before that, another traditional step is for me to mention that, first of all, I have received this transmission numerous times from His Holiness the Dalai Lama and from some of the Geshes that I've translated, meaning monastic professors that I've translated for, and I think from a few other of my teachers, but primarily from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which is why this text, the notes that we have begin here with a quote. The Dalai Lama says here, I recite the 8 verses of mind training by Langri Tangpa every day and regularly apply it to my life. When I'm delayed at an airport, I reflect on these verses, and before going into potentially difficult situations, I contemplate them as well. And for our online participants, I'll just say that we can email you the notes later on, because what to do, so you'll just contact Sangha Yoga School, you need to receive a PDF. It's just 2 pages on both sides. So that's what His Holiness is saying. He's saying that he's reciting this text every day. And when receiving these teachings from him, I have numerous times heard him encourage people to learn this text by heart, to keep it somewhere close, to recite it daily. And indeed, it is a wonderful idea to recite it when you are stuck at an airport, what to do, or you are in public transportation, because it is something incredibly down to earth, something very practical. But at the same time, if we look at it very deeply, we can also see the entirety of the path to awakening there as well. And the quote from the Dalai Lama is from a wonderful book called Approaching the Buddhist Path. If you want to have a written commentary on these texts, I would encourage you to, first of all, explore that specific book, because it talks about many other wonderful things related to Tibetan Buddhism. It kind of is an introductory book on Tibetan Buddhism in general, explaining how to view different questionable statements in traditional Buddhist texts, how to understand the Buddhist path in general, what to begin with, how to build a daily practice, and so forth. So it goes through all of that. But amongst all of those different things, it provides an abbreviated but very practical commentary to the 8 verses. And that whole book, Approaching the Buddhist Path, is the first volume in a wonderful cycle of books co-written by the Dalai Lama and his American disciple, Bhikshuni Thupten Chodron, who's an abbess of a wonderful monastery in Washington State. And the book cycle itself, called Library of Wisdom and Compassion, covers the entirety of the Buddhist path. It now has 9 volumes, probably more coming. So it's like very, very, very thorough. But it starts at the beginner level, which is where we can imagine ourselves. And even at the beginner level, we can already start working with a specific text. So that's why it's given as a sort of a reference point for later exploration. And also, if you revisit it, or if you visit a text like that, if you explore text like that, you would hopefully see that I'm not making anything up, or certainly not much. And of course, if I'm ever saying something meaningless or mistaken, that's fully on me. Whereas when you refer to a written commentary, you would have first highest quality material. And along those lines, I should also say that it's, even though I've received these transmissions numerous times and interpreted sometimes on those occasions, I'm not at all here as a quote capital T teacher, not at all. This is just a friendly discussion. We're all equals. And in fact, my preferred type of self-perception in these situations is that we're all in a class together and I'm the worst student in class, and the strict teacher, in this case it's Kat, tasked me with preparing a slideshow, and I don't have slides this time, usually I do, but I've made some notes and now I'm supposed to talk through my notes, and everyone is scrutinizing me very thoroughly, and I'm just trying to not make too many mistakes and, escape with some dignity, and just bring some benefit, not because there's any benefit in my convoluted explanations and my broken English, but because there's beauty in the material itself. So the material of Lobsang Tenpa will be long gone, but the material will live in your heart forever, so let's hope for that. So first verse here, and the verses here actually are translated by another non-sleeping yogi, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who passed away just a couple of months ago, 52 days ago, essentially. He was the founder of the Jamyang Buddhist Center in London, in Elephant and Castle. Some of you might have heard of that wonderful institution. I teach there sometimes. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche was an incredibly realized yogi, Sherpa, not Tibetan ethnically, so from Nepal originally, very close disciple of the Dalai Lama and many other great masters. And he passed away at a very senior age, having survived stroke and many other things. But he was a yogi of the highest caliber and a translator himself. So he translated these verses based on his realization and his practice of them. So that's why I like to refer to this translation. But you will find many other translations of them. There's dozens. So the first one reads, determined to obtain the greatest possible benefit from all sentient beings who are more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel, I shall hold them dear, most dear at all times. And then in my notes, it says that the practice here is seeing every being as precious. To foster that, we can do specific types of meditation. So what's true of these verses is that they can be translated in two different ways, and there's actually two versions of these verses in Tibetan. One version would always say, I shall, and then blah, blah, blah. I shall do this. Another version would say, may I, blah, blah, blah. So both versions are correct. They're just a teaching and a prayer, you could say. When it says I shall, it's sort of a list of things to do. We can discuss them, explain them, practice with them, revisit them. In the version that says may I, that version is for our daily recitation in a way. So we can actually begin our day by waking up, meditating a little bit. And then after we've done our concentration meditation, observed our breath or something like that, or have done some loving kindness practice, we would then recite a text like this, saying, may I hold them most dear at all times, and then replacing I shall with may I in every subsequent verse. And in that way, we would program our mind to be mindful of these practices, of these 8 practices for the rest of the day. And then during the remainder of the day, we would actually encounter issues, problems, situations, and so forth. And we would be reminded, oh, well, I actually wanted to practice this and that. So let me actually try and apply this. So we would be, for example, as it says here in the first verse, trying to see every being as precious. So that in itself already should appear to be somewhat difficult, because while we are usually able to see beings that we like as precious, and in this case, it's quite easy. Oh, we're such a lovely environment. Obviously, everyone present here has strong devotion to the qualities of wisdom, compassion, mindfulness, and so forth. That's why we're sacrificing these hours, right? We're here to do something good. So it's quite easy to be full of good vibrations towards everyone gathered here. It's like, we're such a community of, the energy of love. We're truly making a difference, which we are. Yes, let's praise ourselves for that. But then we go out and there's all these other people there, most of them strangers, meaning we're kind of indifferent towards them, and some of them jerks, or is it traditionally described enemies, meaning people we are not really comfortable with. And I don't really know much about the dynamic here, but it's also possible that for some of you, some of the others are already in the jerk category as well. Crossed wires here and there. So that already shows us that we are not necessarily seeing every being as precious, because some of them are more in that jerky category, right? So what to do? Well, um, teachings such as this one and all the teachings on love, compassion, and so forth in no way negate the social conventions of us being more close to our children than to the children of a lady next door. So there's this social appropriateness, the social expectations of first and foremost taking care of our children or of our dogs, of our partners, and then trying to expand and extend the care to others. That doesn't go anywhere. And in fact, part of the Bodhisattva commitments with those who are on the path for full awakening, one of those commitments is to deeply respect the social conventions, unless those social conventions need to be changed, right? Because there's, of course, things that have to do with racism and so forth, and that needs to be socially transformed. But when those social conventions are not in themselves necessarily harmful, we are to be mindfully aware of those. And yet, in terms of our deeper perception, we can undertake a paradigm shift, which would allow us to first artificially and then naturally see every being as sort of a glowing sun of perfection in itself. So to see every being as something precious, or to see, that's another way of describing this verse, every being as having Buddha nature within them, knowing that Buddha nature is something incredibly important for the Buddhist path in general, specifically the Mahayana Buddhist path. So a small caveat here. Actually, when these verses are explained, they're very rarely explained with any references to the Buddha nature theory, as it's called. Usually, the explanation for this specific verse is that we need to cherish all beings as being precious, because that would allow us to cultivate compassion and wisdom. So it's utilitarian in nature. Beings are precious because unless we focus on them with wisdom and compassion, we're not going to cultivate wisdom and compassion, so we're not going to become awakened beings. So it's very practical. I do need these beings because they are the source of my compassion, the training basis. I focus on them to become more compassionate. If the beings were not here, it wouldn't work. So thank you, beings. You're incredibly precious for me in that regard. Without relying on you, I would not be able to become a Buddha. So that's the traditional explanation. It's very common, and it's absolutely logical, reasonable, very, very profound in itself, very applicable. But I'm a huge fan of the Buddha nature theory. I've studied it during my years in Nepal and with some brilliant philosophy teachers and some great practitioners as well. And so I like to introduce it into this explanation when possible. So just a brief overview of what that means, right? Because some people might be completely new to the idea. So Buddha nature theory is part of the overall Buddhist philosophy. Oh, I can now see myself on Zoom because I was dark silhouette and now there's a little bit more light because I changed the position. Um, so Buddha nature theory is part of the overall Buddhist philosophy that comes quite late in the Buddhist teachings. It was not presented in his earliest discourses, which is why it's quite absent from Theravada teachings. There are some references to the brightly shining mind and so forth, but these are not elaborated on. So you would not really see the mention of so-called Buddha nature in the Pali sources, not so much. Then not so much also taught in the so-called second turning of the will, which is all about compassion and emptiness. And emptiness, or shunyata, is of course a very big Buddhist thing, very important. So there's no denying that we absolutely need to master that as well. And that's what the 8th verse would be on. But not so much, once again, on the Buddha nature. And then in the latest teachings of the Buddha, or the latest teachings said to be originally transmitted by the Buddha. Of course, there's academic discussion about that. In the latest teachings of the Buddha, in the so-called third turning of the will of Dharma, there's finally a presentation of this so-called Buddha nature theory, which basically states that deep within us, underneath all the levels of confusion, all the levels and layers of afflictive mental states, misunderstandings, wrong views, compulsive habits that are harmful in their nature and so forth. Underneath all of that, there is a certain potential for perfection. potential for infinite wisdom and infinite compassion. And within that, based on those original teachings attributed to the Buddha, there's two major ways of describing what this Buddha nature is. These are sometimes referred to, for simplicity, as the discovery approach and the cultivation approach. So the discovery approach says that Buddha nature means that we are already fully perfect on the inside, and we just need to uncover that perfection. We just need to remove all the dirt from the mirror, and then the mirror itself, because it's already a mirror, would reflect reality perfectly as reality is. So the only thing we need to do is to remove everything that's in the way. There are similar approaches in Christianity and in Jewish mysticism and so forth, and Sufi mysticism as well, where the only thing we need to do is to stop doing everything that's holding us away from the true nature of reality. So just stop doing the wrong thing, and then the right thing in itself will flourish and uncover because it's already there in its full glory. So the discovery approach, that's quite strongly represented, for example, by the Zen tradition, also known as the Chan tradition in the Chinese, in the tradition that relies on Chinese, it's Chan, Zen in Japan, Son in Korea, Tien in Vietnam. So you have these four names for the same major branch of Buddhism, in which through practices such as silent illumination or koan work, working with koans, or the questioning practice of Huato, you sort of allow all the confused mental states to gradually dissipate, and then the natural perfection emerges. So that's a very powerful approach in those branches of practice. The other approach, the approach of cultivation, describes Buddha nature as merely a seed or a potential that needs to be grown. So you have the acorn, but it's not yet the oak tree. Fundamentally, they have a similar nature, but they're not at all equal to each other. So what do? You take that acorn and you cultivate it by training the muscles of wisdom, of compassion, of patience, of generosity, concentration, all of these different skills that you need, different qualities of a fully awakened Buddha. You train them like you would train in a gym. You have your leg day, you have your chest day, and those are literally different aspects of practice that we gradually bring together. And eventually, when you have trained enough, you would achieve a major breakthrough where it opens up into infinity. Your qualities have become infinite, and then you're fully awakened Buddha. So your acorn has become an oak tree. And yet initially it's just an acorn, so nothing to be too excited about. So it prevents us from becoming complacent, from saying, oh, no, I'm already perfect on the inside. Yeah, it's like, okay, but you're a complete jerk on the outside, so what to do? How to reconcile that? So the approach of cultivation protects us from going into that extreme of complacency. And it is quite strongly represented by the Theravada tradition itself. Because in the Theravada tradition, when you are doing practices of loving kindness, compassion, and so forth, developing single-pointed concentration of samatha, practicing insight through practices of vipassana, that's a lot of work. And you also need the solid foundation of ethics underneath of that. And when you've gathered all of that, eventually you can liberate your mind to a greater degree and eventually break through. So that's the other approach. The Tibetan tradition contains both of these approaches, and they would be more or less emphasized depending on which lineage of practice you follow. And sometimes one lineage of practice would emphasize both, but on different stages of your development. And so they're totally compatible. We just need to lean more one way or lean more another way, depending on where we are and what our personal propensities are. So for some people, it is incredibly encouraging to hear about this already present basic goodness, as it's sometimes called in a more secular context. And these days, there are actually neuroscientific studies being done on basic goodness from a more neurobiological point of view, with regards to children, and whether newborn babies can already recognize kindness and respond to kindness, and whether they respond negatively to acts of violence, which they do, and they do recognize kindness, yada, yada, yada. So basic goodness has become quite a buzzword in itself, even in the secular approaches to all of this material. So for some of us, it's incredibly important to be encouraged by this more discovery approach, being reminded, hey, dip within, underneath all the levels of confusion that I have, there's already perfection. And that perfection is actually present in all beings, not just humans. Ergo, the famous koan, does the dog have the Buddha's nature? It's actually in itself not only a wonderful philosophical questions, which what's there to say? Yes, yes, it does. That's the philosophical answer. In the koan itself, the answers that's given by the master is mu, or in Japanese, or wu in Chinese, which kind of can be translated as na, it's like N-A-H, N-A-H. And you're left confused because, of course, the dog has the Buddha's nature, but the master said, nah. And like, and so you mentally repeat that nah until you arrive at a breakthrough. I'm simplifying it quite a bit, but that's kind of one of the approaches historically used to arrive at a breakthrough into that basic goodness. But the Tibetan tradition offers a lot of different approaches to finding that perfection or to cultivating our acorn, whatever it is that we prefer. And this verse can be quite simply practiced by keeping that in mind. So we'll look at the beings around us, and we can look around right now, and we can think within each one of these beings, there's an acorn, if we prefer that, or a brightly shining sun, if we prefer that. And we can switch between the two, doesn't really matter, and that both are completely valid. So if they have an acorn, it means that acorn will one day be cultivated. Robert Thurman was a very famous Tibetologist, also known as the father of Uma Thurman, but also a very known Tibetologist, and the founder of Tibet House in New York City, says quite often, enlightenment is inevitable, not in terms of us not needing to do anything. We do need to do a lot of stuff in either approach, but in that because they're constantly enlightened beings trying to push us towards enlightenment across multiple eons that go way beyond what's described in Star Wars. This cosmic pattern that includes numerous eons, numerous universes, numerous rebirths, and so forth. So there's always some influence pushing us towards great enlightenment, and towards great enlightenment. At one point, we will reach that enlightenment with our acorn or a brightly shining sun. So, okay, one day we will all reach that perfection. So we're constantly surrounded by potential Buddhas. And that's wonderful. That's certainly one reason to view all beings as dear at all times, as precious at all times. It is true that also by relying on those beings, we will uncover our own Buddha nature to a greater degree. Because, for example, one of the major ways of uncovering our Buddha nature, and that's a teaching from Garchen Rinpoche, who I mentioned, second master who spent a lot of years in concentration camp, is to practice love, meditations on love, loving kindness, compassion. So when we do that, we need these objects, we need other beings to direct loving kindness towards. So they are also precious from that point of view. But fundamentally, they're precious simply because they have Buddha nature. So that's one simple way of looking at it. And if you've read some Hindu literature, and not necessarily strictly Hindu literature, but books by such thinkers as Ramdas and so forth, you would always see references to seeing Rama at the heart of everyone, seeing Krishna at the heart of everyone, seeing divinity at the heart of everyone. So it's a similar concept, it's a similar practice, except Buddhists really don't talk about a self-existent soul so much. They don't talk about Atman as much. Instead, they replace it with other concepts. One of them, somewhat similar, even if not necessarily fully synonymous, is this concept of Buddha nature. So we can think, okay, there's a little Buddha at the heart of everyone, either fully present already or potentially possible. So may I hold them dear at all times. So then the rest of the verse is quite self-explanatory in that the greatest possible benefit means full awakening. I want to attain full awakening by relying on these beings. The way to attain the greatest possible benefit from them is not by tricking them to get more money from them. It's not by seducing them to have sex with them. These are all very fleeting, very unstable types of well-being. The greatest possible well-being is the well-being of my mind fully flourishing, fully uncovering its potential. That's the idea there. So that's something I can work with. These beings are more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel because unlike a wish-fulfilling jewel, which is described as this cosmic artifact that could bring about any type of material well-being that we might need, unlike that wish-fulfilling jewel, which is incapable of bringing us spiritual boons, Other sentient beings, when we attend to them in a proper manner, can bring us to full awakening. A wish-fulfilling jewel described as a specific thing that we could use to materialize gold and jewels and whatever else that we might need. Unlike that, which only grants material wishes, sentient beings, when attended to as being like jewels, can bring us to full awakening. And that's the greatest possible result. So one way to work with this verse in a very simple manner, and by the way, this can be done for all the verses. You can print them out on cards if you wish. Some people do that. Or I don't know, write them out, whatever. It is just to have reminders, essentially post-it notes somewhere, or cutting them out of a piece of paper, just keeping them somewhere. And for example, deciding that we're going to work with this verse for 1 week, let's say. Less would be not particularly practical, but at least 1 week. And we can then repeat the loop endlessly until we're fully awakened. But let's say we take this first verse, we decide to work with it for 1 week, and then we remind ourselves of the meaning of this verse every morning. We carry it with us somewhere. We can even put it on our lock screen, a bunch of different ways of reminding ourselves. And then as we go around, our walking meditation is to simply look at all beings, be like, they're all holders of Buddha nature. They all have Buddha nature. If we choose this technique that I've mentioned of seeing their Buddha nature, we could go for the other path and simply think, yeah, it's in reliance on these beings that I will become awakened. So they're all precious from that point of view. So we can choose either or both at the same time, but it's just going around and looking at beings in this specific way, training in the specific type of perception. And that's a very important practice in itself. In psychological terms, that would be called cognitive training, because we're altering our cognitive habits, our habits of interpreting, perceiving, and understanding reality. And we're changing the habits specifically related to other beings, less so to stones and rocks and roads and cars and so forth. But most of our problems actually occur with regards to beings, not with regards to rocks and roads and stones. Yes, there is an element of suffering that comes from the natural environment. There is an element of suffering that comes from our own body getting sick and so forth. The majority of our problems have to do with our relationships to beings, especially our loved ones and our enemies, less so strangers. So that's something that we're already changing quite profoundly. And people say that even at this stage, before going into the further verses, they have noticed profound transformations in that, wow, suddenly this elderly parent that we're trying to take care of appears to be something very different. It's a future Buddha. It's a bud in the process of gradually flourishing, yes, across multiple lifetimes. But right now, I have a wonderful opportunity to surround this specific bud of a Buddha with love, with compassion, with care. In this process, I will be creating positive karmic imprints, by the way, which is also very important. But more so, I'm using an incredible opportunity to cherish another being's Buddha nature, which is indistinguishable from my own Buddha nature. And therefore, I'm creating an incredibly positive interdependence where every being is cherished, every being is surrounded with care, affection, tenderness. These are all important qualities in sort of the Buddhist psychological model of the mind. And so, wow, let me practice that. So we can try that out for a week, let's say, see if it works, see if it doesn't work. And in addition to just this shift in perception, to literally changing the way we perceive beings and ourselves as well, we can do the practices like the one we did in the very beginning, where we open our heart to an inflow of inspiration, or all the other practices that we do, practices that have to do with concentration, practices that have to do with developing kindness, practices that have to do with developing insight. They will all be then feeding this specific thing, because practices inviting inspiration, even practices such as making offerings, for example, and so forth, or purifying negativities, these are all, in Buddhist view, making our mind more flexible, more receptive for then the simple act of shifting our perception of something. So then you would have people, for example, go to India, quote unquote Westerners, go to India, do a 3-month retreat in which they recite a specific purification mantra. It's called Vajrasattva practice in the Tibetan tradition. You think about all the bad things you've done in this life and all your other lifetimes, and you recite a very long mantra for many, many hours, and then you come out of that retreat, and people are okay. So what was the benefit? Wouldn't it be better to do 3 months of vipassana, or better yet, 3 months of just laying on the beach, sunbathing, maybe 3 months of really intense physical workouts, asana, pranayama, wouldn't that be better? And you come out and you say, well, I know. And then slowly, that's something that I've heard from many people, and I've led 2 retreats like that myself, 3 months retreats of purification. You hear from people, actually, my mind is incredibly more receptive to the Dharma now. Things that have been very hard in terms of shifting perceptions, of training the mind like this, like described in this text, they have become much more easy suddenly. Why? I don't know why. Well, that's because there are mechanisms at the foundation of these retreats. That's why those retreats are done. They're not simply there to continuously transmit this tradition of reciting meaningless mantras in Sanskrit. That's not the idea there. The idea there is that there should be some psychological effect. And that effect is usually our mind becoming more pliable, more flexible, and more easily able to do these kinds of perceptual shifts. So the same logic applies to the following verses. We're experimenting with shifting perception. And the second verse says, when in the company of others, I shall always consider myself the lowest of all, and from the depths of my heart hold others dear and supreme. So the practice is described then as counteracting arrogance and partiality. And some of the thoughts and meditation that we can apply to support our practice of this verse are seeing the relativity, in that we see that there's always someone surpassing us in something, and literally everyone would surpass us in a specific thing. And the other practice to experiment with is practicing respect. So just a tiny bit of explanation here. So well, first of all, when people hear this verse, there's already usually panic if we're describing it in a quote unquote Western context. There's really usually no problems when Tibetans hear this verse being explained, because Tibetan culture has historically not suffered from a nasty little thing called self-hatred. It's a very famous episode that some people would probably be familiar with. One time, at one of the Mind in Life conferences with the Dalai Lama and esteemed scientists from different fields, Sharon Salzberg was a wonderful American author writing mostly about loving kindness and things like that. But although she has a lot of books on many different topics, but loving kindness is kind of her forte, asked His Holiness whether it was appropriate when teaching Westerners to start by teaching them loving kindness towards themselves. So first a lot of self-love, then projecting love to others, which is actually how it's described in many texts anyway. So it wasn't anything novel, but she was asking that question based on her experience of seeing how many people really struggle with loving kindness until they have done many hours of loving kindness practice towards themselves. By the way, that's also my personal experience as well. A major breakthrough in my own practice has occurred when I spent a month in retreat practicing on loving kindness for myself, and only then moved on to loving kindness towards others. It was already when I was a monk for several years, just very worthy investment of my time, honestly, which is why I quite highly recommend that. So she asked the Dalai Lama that, and then explained that a lot of her students from the West, global West these days, and this day and age, the West is not simply the West, it's everyone living in Singapore, Hong Kong, mainland China, all across the globe. Many of them, she said, suffer from self-hatred. And the Dalai Lama said, from what? Beg your pardon? What's that? What's self-hatred? How can you hate yourself? That is so ridiculous, We hold ourselves most dear at all times. We are our most cherished friend, possession. We're proud of ourselves. We're arrogant. It's like all these sorts of things. Hating ourselves. Oh, what a novel idea. Well, it turned out every Western in the room raised their hand when asked whether they have experienced something of that nature, and no Tibetans could really understand what that meant. It's now changing with the Tibetan diaspora because a lot of young Tibetans are growing up in New York and Switzerland and here in London and so forth. So they have a very different emotional landscape now. But historically, it was not really a thing. due to many, many cultural reasons and, the amount of body contact between the mother and the child in the first weeks, yada, yada, yada. There's many factors that we can't really isolate just one. But in either case, because we do have self-hatred, when we hear that we're invited here to consider ourselves the lowest of all, we experience a minor panic attack because how dare you? I've been told by Christianity to see myself as this sinful being, and now I come to this wonderful yoga institution and I learn about the practice of yoga, and I'm once again told to see myself as a worm. What's up with that? Well, the idea is not that. It's not as dramatic. It's really not just. We can think of this and all the other verses as well. What would be a reasonable interpretation of it? Like without this neurotic knee-jerk reaction of I'm being invited to see myself as a horrible being. Not that. And also at the same time not going to the extreme of really having an incredibly puffed up, self-conceited self-image. So what would be the middle way there? Well, the middle way is that relatively towards each individual being, we would find out that there is something that they surpass us in, right? So when I'm comparing myself to any one of you, when were you comparing yourself to me, we would always find something in which one of us exceeds. Inevitably so. That's just logical to think that way. I might be a better, I don't know, baker, which I'm not, and you're a better driver, which you are for sure, because I'm not a driver at all. I'm a better something and you're a better something. I don't know. It's like deliverer of questionable commentaries on texts like this. I'm better at that. Or at least I've done more hours of it, that's for sure. But it doesn't mean you wouldn't be better if you tried. But okay, I've done more hours of it, and you've done more hours teaching hatha yoga or something like that. There's always something in which each individual being would surpass us in. And then another line of thinking. Whatever quality in ourselves we might be proud of, once again, somewhere in this world, there'll be someone who surpasses us in that specific thing. So we shine as a unique interpenetration of different traits, as a unique interbreeding of all of these traits. I'm not the best translator, not the best teacher, I'm not the best in this, I'm not the best in that. Absolutely. There's nothing in the entirety of what Lobsang Tenpa is that I would be the best in the world at. And I have absolutely no shame in admitting that, because I'm a completely unique mixture of all these things with unique karmic connections to different beings that I might be able to help. So I don't need to be the best in the world at anything, as long as I'm good at whatever, sort of relatively good at whatever it is that I am. So for that reason, I'm absolutely happily admitting that I'm the lowest of all in many different ways in this room. Once again, I'm the worst student in class, yeah? And that doesn't at all make me feel neurotically full of self-hatred, unworthy of love, or whatever it is that we might associate with this idea. And because you all have Buddha nature, we've already established that with verse 1, plus that Buddha nature is shining through in your ability to drive and to bake and to teach and to be kind and to be compassionate and to listen to my, once again, broken English and my convoluted explanations. You shine in all of that, and I can really be, wow, experiencing a sense of awe with regards to all of that. So that's the shift in perception, the gentle shift of perception that's acquired here. And the purpose for it is to cut down my arrogance, which is a negative mental state. Sometimes the word pride is used, but we know that pride can mean both a positive mental state and a negative mental state. Also, happy Pride Month, everyone. So there's also that, which is why in more recent translations, words like conceit and arrogance are used more frequently. Conceit is always a negative. Arrogance is always a negative thing, whereas pride can be positive and negative. And in Tibetan, there are two different words for the positive pride and the negative pride. Anyhow, arrogance, okay. Arrogance is never good. Actually, when this text is sometimes described more elaborately, there are explanations about the types of karma that we create if we are arrogant. And one of the types of karma, which would be quite logical if we accept the theory of karma, we live in accordance with it, would be that if we're arrogant towards some specific beings, we're quite likely to end up, at least in our future lives, exactly where they are right now, and then suffer the same type of arrogance towards us. which makes me think, wow, history of Britain is probably the same two groups of people, replacing each other in those karmic roles of the upper class, the working class, taking one rebirth after another, just shifting those roles because it was culturally conditioned within people, and that's of course not at all limited to the UK, to feel a bit conceited about one's social standing. And there's really no reason to be conceited because we all might end up on the street the next day. Trust me, as a current refugee, we might end up in all sorts of ways. And so, and our identities will shift in all sorts of ways. We're healthy today, we won't be healthy tomorrow. We're a Buddhist monk today, tomorrow we're not a Buddhist monk. It's like things shift all the time. So no reason to grasp at our identity in that manner, even though we can use it as a helpful tool while it's with us. So only that, and yes, indeed, also thinking there's a whole range of beautiful Buddha natures all around me, and I bow to that, practice respect towards that. So it says here that we can also learn to view others as precious, esteemed guests. It's also a very traditional idea for the Sanskrit cultural tradition in general. It's quite important in some Hindu teachings and in Buddhist teachings as well. Just thinking, wow, well, quite literally right now you are all guests. I'm a guest here as well, but you are guests who have come here to this community space to learn something, practice something, find something of value, or just listen to all of it and then decide, yeah, that's not for me. And that's also totally fine. But regardless of what you decide about this material, I need to treat you with the respect as esteemed guests. Similarly, I am treated with respect because I am a guest. So we're all kind of guests. So we are exchanging that energy of respect, therefore creating positive karmic seeds, and also cultivating one of the important psychological aspects of our mind, which is literally translated as respect. It's one of the positive mental states, of positive mental factors within our consciousness. And the more we're able to strengthen it and project it towards all beings at all times, the better we are equipped to eventually fully uncover our Buddha nature. So we're training in treating beings respectfully, and that in itself is bringing closer to enlightenment. Isn't that funny, right? Because we think, oh, what's going to bring me closer to enlightenment is dhyana, samadhi, found breathing techniques, sacred mantras, tantra, all those sorts of things. I was like, no, start at this very difficult practice of treating others with a lot of respect, even if they are not particularly worthy of respect in your understanding, either because their social standing is not quite right, or because they're not looking particularly fancy, or because they have beliefs that you don't share, which is quite possible. We have very different political beliefs, some of us, and social beliefs and different ideas about, dare I say, vaccinations or climate change. And it's like, ooh, big words. It's like you mentioned, it as a wave going through the room of potential panic, and with a good reason. But then, can I at least maintain heartfelt respect for everyone because of their Buddha nature, or just because they're humans? So that's the training there. And once again, we can write it down on a card, carry it with us, put it on our lock screen, and train in specifically that for 1 week. And then move on to the third verse, which says, vigilant, the moment a delusion appears in my mind, endangering myself and others, I shall confront and avert it without delay. So delusion here is Lama Zopa Rinpoche's choice for translating the Tibetan word nyongmong, which literally means affliction, afflictive mental state, distortion. Mental distortion is a translation that I like. Lama Zopa Rinpoche translated it as delusion. Sometimes delusion is used in a more technical sense to translate the name of one specific affliction. Klesha is the Sanskrit word for it, and it just means literally mental states that distort the fabric of our mind and make us misperceive reality, and also make us suffer because our mind is then kind of constricted like that. So Buddhism describes quite a few of those klesha, quite a few of these mental afflictions. Sometimes they're also translated as disturbing emotions, but that translation is debated a little bit because quite a few of kleshas are not emotions. They're cognitive states, and so forth. So afflictive mental states, disturbing mental states, what are they? Well, quintessentially, there's a list of three, which you would be familiar with most likely: ignorance, attachment, and aversion, or ignorance, desire, and hatred. There's different ways of translating those as well. But once again, one is just oblivious to the nature of reality, totally misunderstands reality. Then the next one wants to grasp at the pretty things because it misinterprets them. It sees them as being prettier than they actually are, more capable of fulfilling our wishes than they actually are. So that's desire or neurotic attachment, which is not to be confused with psychological definition of attachment. That's a very different thing. In psychology, attachment is often a positive thing, meaning a bond, a healthy bond between a mother and a child, or between romantic partners. That's a good thing. No debate there. There needs to be that bond between the mothering being and the being that's being mothered, But that's not the idea here. The Buddhist definition of attachment is a mental state that exaggerates the pleasant characteristics of an object, and for that reason that wants to possess that object or increase the quantity of the object that we possess, or to hold on to the object even though it's slipping away. So when I overestimate the deliciousness of something, that's quite literally what attachment does, and it is described as the most pervading, the most omnipresent affliction of all. Even though ignorance is at the root of it, ignorance is in a way more neutral, less problematic in that, okay, we just misunderstand reality. We misunderstand our own self, the nature of our mind, how things exist. But then when something projects out of that ignorance, the main thing that gets projected, the main thing that arises out of that very fertile soil of ignorance is attachment, and it's attachment that causes most of our suffering. When attachment doesn't get what it wants is when aversion arises, the flip side of that. And aversion is a state of mind that exaggerates the negative traits, the negative characteristics of an object, and for that reason wants that object to be destroyed or eliminated. And so we're stuck in this cycle where, under the influence of ignorance, misunderstanding reality, we see some objects as delicious, even though they're not really that delicious. We try to grasp them. And because there would be others tugging on those same objects and wanting them and competing with us and so forth, we see those others as potential obstacles or actual obstacles, and we want them destroyed because we over-exaggerate, we exaggerate their negativity. Oh, these beings, these nasty beings, and these need to be killed, these need to be eliminated, these need to be fired, these need to be blocked. I love blocking people on Instagram. Oh, like you wouldn't believe. So that's my aversion in action. And that's how it all works. So from a Buddhist point of view, that's at the root of samsara. So if you've seen the wheel of samsara, it's a lovely thing that would often be displayed on the entry to a monastery's temple. So right there at the temple doors, you enter a monastery, it's usually a compound. Within the compound itself, there's a temple building, or hakang, and at the doors of that, there would often be this depiction of the wheel of life with 6 realms of rebirth and so forth. And at the very heart of that, there would be a depiction of a pig, a snake, and a rooster. And those represent these 3 poisons, as they're sometimes described. So even to catch those would be quite nice. And to this universal set of 3, 2 more are sometimes added. And those are envy and pride. More or less self-explanatory. Pride as an arrogance, conceit, oof, I'm higher than you. And envy as this feeling of discomfort that arises when someone else is succeeding, it's getting promoted, getting all the, chicks or all the guys, it's like, So that feeling of discomfort, called envy, is the 5th affliction then. And there are other lists. They're sometimes expanded to include many derivative afflictions, and those are quite interesting to study, to observe in our own mind, to catch, to counteract, or sometimes they're just essentialized into this list of 5. But even if we were to work with this list of 5, ignorance, and it's primarily ignorance with regards to interdependence. So not really understanding how causes leads to results. Well, not really understanding how what's happening here affects what's happening there. How is it possible that dumping our nuclear waste in that other part of the world will still affect this part of the world. Is that possible? We're digging black oil there, but still affect what's happening here. Or can we cut down all the Amazon forests and still be quite okay on this side of the world? Not, but we don't know that. Oh, causes leads to results. Incredible. Not even on a very practical level, our genuine inability to understand why is it that our wish to gossip about everyone with everyone leads to us having the reputation of a person who likes to gossip. Like that fundamental confusion. And it's really fascinating when we think about it, but that is what is described here as ignorance, misunderstanding of interdependence. There's much deeper levels of it. For example, knowing emptiness would be the reverse, the flip side of those more profound types of ignorance. But on the surface level, it's ignorance about causes, conditions, interdependence of different kinds, which is why it's actually sometimes said that the main teaching of the Buddha is the teaching of interdependence, because you can literally include every other teaching included in Buddhism on meditation, on love, on compassion, on karma, all of those sorts of things. You can all describe them all as types of interdependence. So if you know interdependence, you know the entirety of Buddhism and the entirety of science as well, because that's what all science is about, right? Interdependence of physical phenomena, chemical phenomena, biological phenomena, and so forth. So here we are invited to practice mindfulness. And this is where popular mindfulness is quite applicable. The traditional definition of mindfulness was different, not the same as the popular definition that has been spread quite widely by Jon Kabat-Zinn and his colleagues. And popular definition, as many people would know, describes mindfulness as non-judgmental awareness of whatever is arising in our body and mind in the present moment. So sort of like non-judgmental aware presence in the here and now. That's the popular mindfulness. Very helpful, very, very beneficial for our mental well-being, for overcoming stress, for working with addictions. There are many very wonderful applications of it. And Dalai Lama is very supportive of it as a system of practice, as a modality for healing. But one time when Jon Kabat-Zinn presented his findings on popular mindfulness to the Dalai Lama said, it's incredibly helpful. Just don't forget that it's not Buddhism, meaning it's not the totality of Buddhism. So it's important to not be colonial and not say, oh, we've cracked the code of Buddhism. It's all about mindfulness. Let's be mindful. And then it's like a bunch of white people meditating together, being mindful and saying, we've learned the essence of Buddhism. It's just being mindful, which happens a lot. And as a Tibetan Buddhist, a Tibetologist, let's say, as a Tibetologist, I find that very depressing in a way, but and very colonial, honestly. But if we step away from that, yes, that type of popular mindfulness would be actually very helpful here, because what does it allow us to do? We notice the states of our mind, we observe the states of our mind, and through that, we're able to then alter the states of our mind. So it's only non-judgmental when it comes to noticing something. It is totally fine to then make valid judgment about what to do with it. So to explain that bit, there's often an analogy given. We are at a buffet and we are making a choice. We're trying to be healthy, let's imagine. We're making a choice with yesterday's butter fried, I don't know, pig fat, and something that's healthy, green, light, freshly made, free of excessive sodium and so forth. So if we were to only practice popular mindfulness as it is described sometimes with this ridiculous level of exaggeration, would be like, oh, I should be non-judgmental. It's all good, equally good. Obviously not. You have to make valid choice when it comes here, when it comes to this. So equally here, yes, we are initially aware of what's happening in the mind. We're not trying to immediately stifle it all and block it all and chase it away. No, we do need to notice it first. But then we're perfectly capable of making valid choice about nourishing these mental states and discouraging these other mental states. So there are then different strategies for going about it. But the first thing we need to do is to notice these mental states. And then there could be a whole 3-year retreat with us just talking about the different antidotes that we could be using here. So just this one verse alone could take up a lot of time. But fortunately, there is a way well, it says here, I'll just read out my own note here. For counteracting, mastering appropriate antidotes and training with them over and over. Ultimate antidote is the understanding of emptiness, but for the relative levels, it's love and compassion for anger, seeing impermanence and limited nature, for neurotic attachment, and so forth. So, for example, if the mental state that we're trying to counteract is anger towards other beings that arises within us again and again, we could, as an antidote, consistently train in such practices as loving kindness and compassion. They would really remove a lot of a lot of our habits related to anger, neurotic anger. Then for excessive attachment to, let's say, sex, a very, very common example given in the Buddhist teachings. We would do such practices as contemplating the actual nature of the body, in which there are practices, there are meditations there in which we just mentally divide the body into different body parts. I have one on Insight Timer. It's called Meditation on 32 Body Parts. It's a traditional technique, very commonly used in Theravada countries. And you just mentally isolate the different parts of yourself or the different parts of the person that you're lusting after. So if there is a gentleman or lady, a non-binary person that you're lusting after, imagine that on the table in front of you, there's a pile of their hair, body fat, there goes their liver. It does have a bit Hannibal Lecter-like, but it's merely mental exercise. There go their eyeballs, that's their urine in a jar, that's their phlegm in a jar. So go through 32 body parts like that. And the idea is not to, once again, to become Hannibal Lecter. That's not it. It's just what's validly there in the body. That's what their body consists of, and your body as well. So you can get excited about, oh yeah, sex, but in a more balanced way. So we're just trying to move our mind away from excessive excitement about stuff. And yet at the same time, not fall into the extreme of being so horrified by everyone's bodies and how they consist of eyeballs and urine that we become completely unable to act. So Buddhism is always about finding the middle ground between two extremes. It's a wonderful way of describing it, I think. And one extreme would be excessive desire. Another extreme would be excessive aversion to everything. And neither extreme is healthy. So we're just finding ways to balance it. So these would be many, and there were many other antidotes of the same nature towards every affliction. So for pride, some antidotes are about thinking of how little we actually know, right? I've been studying Buddhism for 16 years. I feel like a complete and dumb beginner at all times. And not as in a negative way. It's not self-hatred. I'm just experiencing awe as to how much more there is for me to study, how little I know compared to actually knowledgeable people. And yet at the same time, I know enough to continue practicing. So if you were to lock me up in a cave right now, I definitely know I have enough to keep practicing for the rest of my life as well. So it's not depressing, but it's really humbling. And that humility is not putting myself down, just an antidote for arrogance. So there would also be antidotes for jealousy or envy, and those would especially include training in rejoicing, being able to find joy in the joys of others. So sometimes, just like there's a word, there's compassion, some styles of therapy and psychology use the word compersion for that, but compersion is mostly used when people talk about polyamorous relationships and so forth to describe that sense of joy that you might experience from knowing your partner is having a wonderful time with someone else, blah, 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 blah. Even though the term itself is actually just a mirror term for compassion, it's just joy with something. In Buddhism, we usually translate that as rejoicing. And training in that, thinking, wow, how wonderful, my friend got promoted. Wow, how wonderful, this person just went on vacation and they're showing it off on Instagram. Good for them. You go, girl. That kind of sort of energy slowly becomes more habitual, and then envy actually gets replaced with joy, which also, according to Buddhism, creates wonderful karmic causes for us to experience the same types of flourishing and the same types of material happiness, not just mental happiness. But for now, mental happiness, because we've replaced envy and jealousy, some of the most painful mental states that a human being might have, with something wonderful. So actually, when this verse is being explained in detail, it's said that we can train in transforming our afflictions in 3 different ways. We can transform them through view, through meditation, and through conduct. And these are 3 quintessential elements of the Buddhist path: conduct, meditation, and the view. The view is the highest one. It's, for example, the view of emptiness or the view of the true nature of our mind. That one is described in such teachings. Mahamudra, a great seal, Dzogchen, the great perfection, where we're introduced to the ultimate nature of reality in different ways. So resting in that is the highest level of practice, most advanced. It's literally being resting in the nature of reality as it is. Quite profound. We need a lot of preparation for that. So for most of us, that's not where we begin, even though eventually, when we master that, all the afflictive mental states would just dissolve through us resting in that profound state of empty luminosity. That's something we're aspire for, but for most of us, we're not there yet. So we learn these individual antidotes for individual problems. Loving kindness for anger, 32 body parts for excessive lust, like, and so forth. We master individual antidotes and they become part of our overall collection of inner medicine. They become part of our tools for self-regulation. All these practices have many wonderful qualities of their own. Loving kindness is not only used as an antidote for anger. Dissecting the body into 32 body parts is not only used to counteract lust, because it can also be practiced to establish insight. It's actually a style of vipassana or vipassana, and so forth. So all these antidotes are helpful in themselves. But if not that, then the most foundational level is counteracting afflictions through conduct, through what we actually do. So one very simple example is that if you're addicted to something, don't go to the place where that's on offer. So if anyone is in recovery, you know that the first basic idea is, if you're an alcoholic, don't go to a bar. And actually in mind training teachings and Lobsang teachings, in the more elaborate version of those called the 7-point mind training, which we're talking about having a full course on, one of the commitments there is don't be risky with it. Don't go into places that you're not really prepared for. So if you know that these people really annoy you, don't go and hang out with them if you don't want to be annoyed. Like if your mind is not ready to deal with this level of challenge, don't go into that situation. Unless, of course, life pushes you into, wars, refugee crisis, pandemic, that's another thing. But if we have some choice in the matter, we can just avoid those problematic areas. And another very simple way of dealing with our afflictions in terms of our conduct is taught by the great master Shantideva, who is sort of a source for these teachings and all the Lobsang teachings. It's very famous for his text, Way of the Bodhisattva, an entry to the Bodhisattva's way of life, or just what Bodhisattva's way of life, Bodhisattva's, that's the most common translation, Bodhisattva's way of life. Very, very important author. Incredibly beautiful text that he wrote, very frequently quoted by the Dalai Lama and many other masters, the source for all these teachings. He says that when we're catching ourselves getting afflicted, we just need to stay still like a block of wood. So let's say you're getting pissed at something, right? You're noticing that you're becoming somewhat annoyed with your boss. And not in a way where you can just very gently introduce what the problem is, explain what would be a better way to communicate, set healthy boundaries. Not that. You're just irrationally pissed, and what's going to come out is not going to be good, and it's not going to lead to a healthy conversation. He's going to get defensive and maybe fire you, or if not, like drama. So to avoid the drama, you just rest like a block of wood. And actually, there's a whole practice around that. We did it very briefly in the beginning when we were relaxing our body, speech, and mind. There's a wonderful way of doing that same practice by remembering 3 key points: stillness of the body, silence of the speech, spaciousness of the mind. And each one of them can be practiced individually, or they can all be practiced together. But even to remember stillness of the body. So let's say you're getting somewhat pissed about something, or you're feeling that you're becoming somewhat desirous of something. Like you have that unsettled, restless energy that's saying, oh yeah, no, let's go out, let's have drinks tonight. And you're just not really sure, is that a healthy mental state, or am I just being neurotically moved by those desires? It's fine to go and have drinks perhaps, but we just want to be sure, right? So you just, for some time, focus on the stillness in the body. In whatever position you're in Shavasana, sitting up, standing down, whatever it is, you just let go and you just focus on that stillness, connecting to that underlying level, which is actually directly related to the ultimate nature of reality. which we might arrive at the level of the view. But right now, we're just focusing on that stillness. And after a while, the neurotic element will dissipate, and then we'll be able to assess our desire with more clarity or address our boss with more clarity. Because the problematic emotional episode has passed, the problematic episode of desire has passed, and we can address what needs to be addressed with just that greater clarity. So that's being still as a block of wood. But that's a wonderful technique that we know if everyone on the planet just waited for a few minutes before reacting, before sending that email, before starting a war, wouldn't that be lovely? So we have an opportunity to train in that ourselves. And that's the third verse. We catch ourselves having affliction, and then we either rest in the ultimate view, or we apply specific antidotes, such as going into loving kindness, or we just remain like a block of wood, which can be actually a whole system of meditation training in itself. Very helpful. So that's the third one. In a way, it covers working with all of the afflictive mental states, neurotic habits, compulsive desires, and so forth. Also goes for our habits, by the way. Addictions, I don't know, compulsive lying, serial cheating, chain smoking, throwing plates at people, whatever it is that we know, oof, is not quite good. Maybe we've established that through therapy. We've established that, oh, the source of problems in my life is that I'm throwing plates at people, or that I really always self-soothe through these unhealthy techniques. Well, instead, let's just wait. And actually, once again, people in recovery know that when you're in recovery and you're getting those episodes of desire towards the whatever it is that you're addicted to, that only lasts for about 30 minutes, sometimes way less, but almost never more than 30 minutes. So if you're able to just hold still for those 30 minutes, it will pass. It's in those 30 minutes that there's the greatest danger of relapse. And having the skill of being still like a block of wood is one of the most wonderful things to have in your toolkit for that. Then we're continuing on working with beings that might be causing us anger. Whenever I see beings who are wicked in nature and overwhelmed by violent negative actions and suffering, I shall hold such rare ones dear as if I had found a precious treasure. So difficult people that are referred to in this verse are explained in two different ways. One way to explain them is at people who are actually nasty in terms of how they deal with others, what they do in this world. So the dictators, the horrible bosses, the corrupt politicians, and so forth. Our personal list of people who we think are evil would be quite long, probably. So it's all of those, plus another explanation from some of the traditional commentaries is people that we see as being impoverished, but we avoid them because of that. So unsheltered people, for example, there's quite for most of us, at least, there's that moment of distancing. We're probably nice people in that we're not going to be punching them, attacking them, yelling at them, and so forth. But there's just that, oh yeah, like sure, bye, that level of distancing. And that this verse also concerns that. So what's the suggestion there? Holding difficult people dear, but now it's even stronger than in the first verse. We are now recognizing that for us to be able to cultivate deep compassion, it is especially helpful to be around people who are difficult. Yes, all beings are suitable objects of compassion. That's why we see them as precious jewels in the first verse. But it is especially helpful to have people who are difficult. And sometimes it is actually said in the Bodhisattva teachings that bodhisattvas, meaning people who are already quite advanced on the path, beings who are advanced on the path, some of them way beyond what we consider to be possible, they are actually praying to have difficult people in their life because their karma is quite purified. They don't have much karma left to be meeting jerks, and that yet they need the jerks to cultivate deeper levels of patience, deeper levels of compassion. So we should be appreciative of the difficult people in our life, and we can mentally make a list. Who's the most difficult person in my life? Okay, mom. It's like a list usually starts with something like that. Not because mom is the worst, but because we have to interact most frequently. And there's just tiny jabs here. And when are you getting married? Oh, you're not getting any. The clock is, okay. Difficult. So what am I supposed to do? Hold her dear. Hold them dear. Hold all of them dear. Once again, because they have Buddha nature and because it's on the basis of interacting with them that I'll be able to cultivate profound states of compassion. And it does help with these verses to actually train in compassion, to learn compassion meditation, and to do a lot of it. So that actually would be making practice of this verse much easier. So once again, if we were to cut up the verses into little cards and try to practice with them, this one would invite us to, for a week, especially offer our kindness and compassion to the difficult people, and to especially focus on their Buddha nature and their inner glow. That helps us. Another logic that's sometimes used here is that we never know who's actually a Buddha in disguise. More so, in the Buddhist teachings, it's said that we have no logical way of establishing that we're not the last unenlightened being in existence. It is quite possible that everyone else has become enlightened, and everyone we're seeing is an emanated form that the Buddhas are manifesting to present this illusory play so that the poor old us is able to cultivate greater levels of compassion, greater levels of wisdom. And then once we are awakened, there'll be a huge party because everyone else is already enlightened. And we don't know. And they were just manifesting as, the horrible presidents of the world, prime ministers and evildoers and so forth, to help us finally break through our barriers. Okay. So that's another logic we can sometimes use if we find it inspiring. Verse 5 talks about an even more personal affront. When out of envy others mistreat me with abuse, insults, or the like, I shall accept defeat and offer the victory to others. There's always the same question that asks with regards to this verse. So offering victory, how do I do that if it's about matters of social justice, protecting others, ending wars, ending racism, ending homophobia, and so forth? Well, that's not what this verse refers to, honestly. It's not about giving up on important matters. It's about offering victory in terms of becoming willing to listen, becoming willing to admit, to adjust. And for example, one way of not doing that is when someone's giving us feedback, and we do subconsciously a very manipulative thing that we all do in a way. At least I know I've done it many times. We're offered some feedback and then we say, oh, well, in that case, I'm not going to say anything at all ever, as if there's only two extremes of me saying whatever I want or me not saying anything ever. So when I catch myself having those thoughts, I instead try to go to, okay, can you tell me more about how can I best express my positive intentions in this situation? What would be a language that works best for you? Like, what's the optimal way of communicating here? What is it that you feel when that language? So an actual communication, like making sure the other person is heard, because that's how I want to be treated when I voice my feedback and so on. That's offering victory because we've already admitted that what the other person is feeling, what they are saying, and so forth is valid, at least relatively, situationally. So we're willing to change. And then sometimes offering victory would just mean staying quiet and nodding. Sometimes it would mean initiating a discussion like that. So there are many ways of doing it, but what it means is that we don't always need to have the last word. And that in itself is a huge paradigm shift. But beyond that, the next one says, when someone whom I have benefited and in whom I have great hopes gives me terrible harm, I shall regard that person as my holy guru. So that's kind of us coming to the end of the insult line. So first we met someone difficult. Well, first we were looking at all beings and trying to see ourselves as the lowest of all, catch our mind when it's becoming afflicted. Okay. Then we met some difficult people. Okay, tried working with them by seeing them as precious. Then they started insulting and abusing us. That's not nice. And then finally, someone who really we've invested years of our life into them. Our child, partner, a job companion, many situations of that nature. They betray us, the worst. Very traumatic, actually, from many points of view. There's a lot of trauma associated with things like that. There's research on how being cheated on is such a traumatic effect, that it's such a traumatic thing for most people, that it generates the same thing as PTSD. It generates PTSD in you, with the one exception that there actually was no battle action. Like, that's the one difference. But everything else, like panic attacks, the response of your nervous system and so forth, can be quite similar. And that's one way of one type of betrayal, because you were not in an open relationship and then you suddenly discovered you were in one, something of that nature. So quite difficult. And we do what we need to do in terms of trauma processing, rewiring, soothing, working with a trauma specialist and so forth. There's lots of stuff that can be done in terms of modern psychology and therapy and all those sorts of things, including body work, very important in those situations. But in terms of letting go, what is it that we can do? We can see how holding on to the grudge is only poisoning our mind. If someone abused us because they're really a sociopath or a psychopath, I'm going to get upset about us being sleepless about their betrayal. If they're genuinely a nasty person, they wouldn't care. And if they're not a nasty person, they already do care, even if they made a mistake. So either way, us holding that grudge is not going to be completely helpful for anyone. Plus, we can think, well, what can I get that's positive out of this situation? At least one thing. Well, it's making me stronger. It's breaking my heart so that more love can flow in and out. It's breaking my grasping. It's reminding me about the nature of samsara. And it's also, of course, from a Buddhist point of view, the ripening of my own karma, because I've harmed others in the past. And we don't even need to go that far. We don't need to think, yes, maybe in past lives I've also betrayed others in the same way. Yes, logically it is so from the Buddhist point of view, but that's not the only thing here. We can just think, yes, I failed others in this life as well. I did not always deliver the goods on the agreed on date. I did not always fulfill all of my promises. Once again, that's 100% guaranteed. No matter how hard we try, and we might be very reliable people, there's always something that falls through the cracks. And although for us it might not be a big thing, it is quite possible that the person on the receiving end was quite upset about that. So we say, yeah, okay, what to do? And we gently learn to let go through all the other practices that we have done so far, but also through self-kindness and self-compassion here as well. So that's difficult, but seeing them as a holy guru does not mean we pray to them or anything like that. It means, well, I mean, there's different techniques, some more radical, some less, but essentially it means holy teacher of patience, of forbearance, perseverance, and of being able to hold on to love and compassion no matter what. So that's an invitation there. And sometimes that's the most, quite obviously, in some ways, this is the most difficult of the verses, and yet not always, because sometimes watching our mind would be at all times would be more difficult than letting go of past harm. And sometimes it would be most difficult to see all beings as having that precious Buddha nature within them. So each verse can be most difficult at a specific point, which is why the invitation from the Dalai Lama is to revisit them all every day. Just gently going through them, reminding ourselves, oh, these are all points that might be applicable. And if something speaks to us more immediately, then we work on that. And then the last two verses describe very important practices, which, if we do manage to organize a course on the 7 points, we will be discussing a lot. So the verse number 7 describes a sacred and secret practice that's known as Tonglen, sending and receiving. And in this day and age, you would see a lot of Tonglen practices on apps like Insight Timer and on YouTube and what have you. But actually, most of those versions of Tonglen are not really true to the tradition, because traditionally, this is a very radical practice that includes many more steps that in this day and age are often omitted in those popular meditations. Those popular meditations are still quite helpful. They're just a unification of love and compassion. Practicing compassion by taking with the in-breath, sending love, kindness, benevolence with the out-breath. That's very helpful. That's a combination of loving kindness and compassion. And actually, to practice that properly, it's best to first train in love and compassion separately and then unite them in Tonglen. But to receive the full benefit of Tonglen, we need to also apply certain preliminary steps and eventually be able to learn Tonglen proper by doing very radical, very extreme visualizations within it, and also hopefully to marry that, to unite that with a strong understanding of emptiness or the ultimate nature of reality. And then Tonglen becomes incredibly powerful. And there are actually traditions which teach Tonglen, there are texts which teach Tonglen as the entire path to enlightenment. Once again, something that within it can be practiced in so many different ways that it would include all the stages. Very powerful. But to get to that point, we need to train. But even at this stage, we can start by practicing some loving kindness and then practicing some compassion. There are many recordings of that nature. I have some Tonglen recordings as well. Very easy to use them. And the verse itself
In short, both directly and indirectly do I offer every happiness and benefit to all my mothers. I shall secretly take upon myself all their harmful actions and suffering, is sometimes recited as a prayer of Tonglen. So in addition to actually doing Tonglen as a meditation in which we visualize stuff, sending, receiving, taking upon ourselves all the suffering of all beings and giving to them all of our happiness, merit, and so forth. In addition to doing that as meditation, there's actually a tradition of reciting Tonglen verses many hundreds of thousands of times. It's actually one of the preliminary practices that are not often prescribed, but sometimes they are. And we would quite literally take our mala or an electronic counter, or just count with our fingers, and we would recite this verse, or there are many other similar verses, 10,000 times, 100,000 times, 500,000 times, by really focusing on the intention there, praying for that to actually come true in our heart. From a Buddhist point of view, only incredibly advanced yogis and yoginis can actually take the suffering of others and the karma of others. They can, but for most of us, that would never happen. So we needn't worry. The paradox there is, for beings who are actually capable of doing that, they would be most happy to do that. For beings who are incapable of doing that, those are the beings who are afraid of it happening. Oh no, what if I take upon myself the cancer of someone else? If you are at that stage, it's not going to happen. It's like that's the paradox there. But there are great masters who take upon themselves the obstacles of others. And sometimes those masters, for example, would take an obstacle from another master, pass away themselves, and that other master is able to continue their work. Something of that nature happened very recently in the Tibetan Buddhist world, and a very clairvoyant female master said that that's what happened, that master was doing this practice for that other master because that other master needed to continue their work. So this one passed away instead. So it's very, very, very high and advanced game that does not really apply to most of us. For us, what would happen as a result of this practice is that our mind would become more courageous, open, loving, and compassionate. So it's just a very advanced form of what Ram Dass's community is starting to call the yoga of heartfulness. It's kind of a very advanced way of practicing heartfulness, or kindfulness, as it's sometimes called. Quite powerful. And then the last verse is the verse on emptiness. So to practice verse 7 would actually be praying like this, just saying this verse over and over again, in whichever translation we prefer. It doesn't have to be this one. And we would actually be doing the Tonglen meditation itself as walking meditation, as sitting meditation, lying down meditation, would accumulate hours of Tonglen practice. And then verse 8 contains two things at the same time, and we're arriving at the end of it. Renunciation and the view of emptiness. They're both included in this verse. Undefiled by the stains of the superstitions of the 8 worldly concerns, may I, by perceiving all phenomena as illusory, be released from the bondage of attachment. So in the Tibetan Buddhist path, renunciation is the beginning of the path. Before we actually go through the path and we become enlightened, we need to establish a certain wish for greater happiness than just this happiness of outer stimulation. That's what renunciation means. Renouncing low quality happiness in order to attain high quality happiness. That's what renunciation is. Not necessarily, going away, living in a cave, stopping, no longer having tea, coffee, or sex. None of those things necessarily would imply renunciation. Renunciation means that we change our perception of happiness and suffering, and we start craving for genuine happiness, samyak sukha, sat sukha, genuine, authentic well-being. So that's what renunciation is. And the false facsimiles of that are described as the 8 worldly concerns, which means attachment to having stuff like money and so forth, attachment to sensory pleasures, pleasant views, smells, and so forth, attachment to hearing praise. Oh, you're so wonderful, Lobsang Tenpa. Thank you for the session. And attachment to having reputation. Oh, Lobsang Tenpa is so wonderful. You should come next time. He was great. So attachment to that, and aversion towards the opposites of that, not having money, unpleasant smells, hearing criticism. Oh, Lobsang Tenpa is horrible. You're horrible, Lobsang Tenpa. And then aversion to having a bad reputation. These are the 8 worldly concerns. But we're super fixated specifically on those because we don't really know that, there's a thing called, in the Greek tradition, eudaimonic well-being, genuine well-being coming from within. That's a whole topic that could be discussed for 3 years in itself, right? But a very, very important thing in Buddhism. And all of these teachings, this entire text is about how to develop that inner well-being. It's not about how to earn more money or have more followers or any of that. But inner well-being will come from practicing these verses. So that's the first half of this verse. We are using specific methods to focus on that ultimate happiness, greater happiness, deeper happiness. And then we also practice with the view of emptiness, by perceiving all phenomena as illusory. And of course, the view of emptiness is exactly what's being studied in monastic universities for 20 years. It's not simply saying, oh, everything is an illusion. Emptiness is also not saying, oh yeah, all atoms are kind of empty inside. That's what emptiness means. Not at all what it means also. And even in the tradition of quintessential instructions, where you're introduced to the view of emptiness or the view of luminosity and so forth, in just a few words, there's a lot of preparation that goes into understanding it properly, and a lot of practice, meditations to cut through all the levels and layers of our grasping. There's a lot of that. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, it's all illusory. But at the same time, one of the great masters that wrote about emptiness, Aryadeva, said, even a doubt shakes the depths of samsara. So even a doubt about the solidity of it all, especially the solidity of our own ego, but beyond that, the solidity of our perception, even a doubt about whether it's all exactly as it seems, starts the process of undoing our grasping. And the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center, Shunryu Suzuki, is a very, very, very well-known Zen teacher, 20th century, wonderful teacher. I regularly reread his biography. Used to use a very powerful key phrase, not always so. So even if we don't know how to practice this last verse in any other way, we can simply apply this very specific thing. Whatever situation we encounter in our life, even being here now, we have some interpretation of being here and now, right? For some people, oh, what a bliss, let's continue. We're already going over time. Let's just keep going. And some people are like, oh my God, this is torture, like worse than that concentration camp. So there's some perception there already, some interpretations. For some people, it's neutral, either way. But if we were just to look at that and say, not always so. Or if we were to look at it and put it as a question, that would be an actual insight practice. Is it always so? Is it always a blissful experience? Is it always torture? Is it always neutral? And we just look into that deeply, not expecting any specific answer. And then whatever it is else that's happening in our life, we wake up and our knee is hurting. And we're like, oh, my knee is hurting. I'm going to get, it's going to probably end badly and I have to go to the doctor and I'm probably not going to be able to blah, 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 blah. We catch that story and we ask, is it always so? Whatever it is. So very helpful technique. So we can do that. And another helpful technique, another helpful phrase, it's also used in Buddhism quite a lot, is don't believe everything you think. So once again, a conceptual interpretation arises in our mind and we just ask, and we just remind ourselves, oh, don't believe everything we think. It's an interpretation that can be an alternative interpretation. So either one of those would already introduce that tiny element of doubt into our world perception. And then slowly through studying that, working with that, studying emptiness and so forth, we can become yogis who have realized emptiness directly and then are actually on the bodhisattva stages, well on their way to becoming fully awakened Buddhists. So in this way, you have the last verse, which includes both renunciation and emptiness. And you have all the other verses, which include compassion and the path to fully uncovering compassion. And all of these verses can be understood in a basic utilitarian manner, which would already be absolutely enough. Or we can view them in the light of the Buddha nature theory, thinking about the basic goodness that lies at the heart of all beings. And through that, whichever one of these we find more inspiring, that can inspire us to continue working with these on a loop. So it's good to go through these on the loop again and again and again. And so it's 8 weeks, 16 weeks, 24 weeks, and so forth. And after a few cycles of doing these verses again and again, working with commentaries, listening to commentary here and there, reading a commentary, we would see gradually, hopefully, some transformation. So if we are really working like that, and then we look back on a year of work of this nature, or a couple of months or a few months, we definitely see some shifts. If not, something went wrong, and we can then troubleshoot with a qualified instructor, talk about our practice, what went wrong, it's not really working. Some adjustments can be made, but the working hypothesis here, tried by many practitioners, which is why this text is still in circulation, is that it will work. So that's my wish. Hopefully it will be working perpetually. The seed is there, and I know I'm continuously inspired by these teachings, so that was my poor student attempt to revisit some of those tonight. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Otherwise, yeah, let's just enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Just so everyone's right, the course that we're talking about is hopefully for 10 Friday evenings, and maybe some of you can will hopefully have the online aspect and the recording. But I would be so grateful if we could do that, because I think this is the kind of community or something that they say that actually does take you just more than just a physical practice, but definitely into yes. He is a Buddha, always testing my patience.
Yeah.
Yes. He's a bit frustrated because he can't communicate the way he normally would. So please be on the lookout for that. I'm hoping to be able to get that organized, and then Rosana was open to people dropping in, which is really beneficial to do the whole thing. Would you guys be interested? Yeah.
So I should just add a couple of words. It's a similar teaching, but more elaborate. It contains the so-called mind training slogans, 50 something, and it goes into much deeper explanation on how to meditate on emptiness, how to meditate on compassion, on love, and some more technical explanations of those points, which here I just mentioned in brief. We can master them, but that text includes them all. And it has a lot of instructions also of how to prepare for death, how to actually pass away, what meditation to do while dying, all those sorts of things. Very helpful from that point of view. So it's more elaborate version of whatever it is that we discussed today. And yeah, super happy to share that if there's any benefit.
That's the next step. This is actually, I get a sense a lot of the people here have done teacher training, yoga teacher training with us, and I know it's like the acorn. It's like it wants to be.
Yeah.
So if you would be so kind to offer.
Well, absolutely. I'm super. I can do my best in terms of these poor person slides and notes, and we'll see how it goes. Yeah. Thank you. Oh yeah. Well. Oh, thank you so much. Yes, I am teaching a retreat in Wales in August, between August 6 and 12. It is a residential retreat in Lampeter, so it's relatively easy to get there from London. There's a direct bus that goes to Lampeter, but it's going to be on loving kindness, compassion, and Buddha nature. So essentially, quite a few of the practices that we've mentioned today, very detailed guidance on all these meditations, and I've led those a few times before, and people have really absorbed those practices quite well. So these are quite beautiful. It's very secular, good for health, good for mental well-being. So everyone's welcome to join. You can join it in person. There's also an online option, and you can just join online, not even watch it, but then eventually you get the recordings, and you can keep working with those as much as you want. You'll get dozens of hours of practice that you can listen to. Yeah, and if you have the emails, or just check it out on my website, Lobsang Tenpa. Yeah, that's all there. So yeah, would be lovely to see any. Yeah, no, I'll try not to. Yeah, I have an itchy finger, but I'll do my best. Yeah, yeah. Well, to be fair, I only block bots or people who get like abusive. Yeah, just to be clear, but still, it's always like, okay. All right, on that note, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for joining us online as well.
Thanks everyone, and we got a little bit